Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Smart Strategies for Designing, Implementing, and Improving an Effective Demand Forecasting Process. My name is Eric Stellwagen, and I'll be the moderator today. We'll begin the webinar shortly, but first let's go over a few logistics. The webinar will run approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll be saving some time at the end for questions and answers. During the webinar, you can submit questions directly to us using the control panel on your screen. You can submit them at any time you wish. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar and compile a list for the Q&A session at the end. We'll also be taking questions during the Q&A session itself. We'll try to address as many questions as possible, but don't worry if we don't get to your question. We'll send you a follow-up email after the conclusion of the webinar to reply. We're also taping this webinar, and we will email everyone a link to the video sometime next week once it's posted. The webinar video, in fact, all of our webinar videos are posted to our website, so you'll find a full archive of past webinars. They're free, and they're a great way to catch up on any past webinars you may have missed. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to James Berry, our senior consultant here at Business Forecast Systems, to present smart strategies for designing, implementing, and improving an effective demand forecasting process.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let me go ahead and introduce myself. Again, as Eric said, I am the Director of Training here at Business Forecast Systems. I have a degree in economics from the University of Chicago. I've been with the company now 16 years, hopefully probably talked to a bunch of you, I'm sure on the phone, or helped with training along the way. So hopefully those of you who I know, hello again, and those of you who are new, hopefully we can have fun going through this seminar today. So in order to begin, let's start with an overview of what we'll be discussing today. So what we really want to talk about is the monthly process that you go through when we work within any kind of forecasting structure. So it's really this big process that we're going to go through. And this process is repeated each forecasting cycle. And there's really sort of common steps that come in each time we set this up. The first step is to gather and update our data. So either we have to, when we're first starting our process, to gather the data together, as well as to update it as we're moving through our different forecasting processes. Once we have our data, we'll load it into some sort of tool to actually go and generate a baseline statistical forecast. We want to actually have a good starting point, a good foundation for generating our forecast so that we can then distribute this forecast and gather up business intelligence. We want to talk to folks who understand your business, who understand your products, who understand your customers. We want to talk to them. We want to gather their intelligence. We want to bring together any of their adjustments to the baseline forecast, and we want to form a consensus. That's really our end goal. Is we want to meet with these folks. We want to come in and we want to form this consensus that we can all feel and agree to as to use going forward. And of course, once we have that consensus forecast, what we want to do is we actually want to consume that forecast. We want to push it back into our planning system, whether we're going to run MRP off of this, financial planning, business reports, anything like that, we want to do this. And most importantly, we're going to repeat this step over and over again on an ongoing basis. So this is kind of the general flow of what we're looking at. We're going to get our data together. We're going to generate a baseline forecast, a starting point. We're going to gather up any kind of adjustments and business intelligence we want to make. We come to a consensus on this forecast, and finally we want to consume that forecast, usually pushing into some sort of larger scale planning system, and then we got to repeat this over and over again. All right, now some of the important questions we need to ask when we're setting up this process just from a big picture standpoint. The first is who's going to be involved in this process. So we have these different steps, and we have different people who could actually come in and bring this information to us, whether that's a demand planner, sales, marketing, manufacturing, finance, or management. And these different folks will have different roles in the process. Who will be gathering the data, who will be doing the initial forecast, who will be making these adjustments, who will come to the final consensus, who will then also be consuming this forecast. So we need to first identify who's going to be in charge of this whole process and where is their role going to be. The second piece is timing. How often are we going to run this process? And that's a really important question to ask. Different companies do different processes and different timings here. So we have lots of different types. It could be sub-daily, daily, weekly, monthly, or quarterly. And depending upon the different industries that you're in, you might have different requirements for how often we're going to run this process, how often we're going to gather intelligence, how often we're updating our forecast throughout this entire process. So here on the slide, we have some different examples. So for instance, in retail staffing, they're doing it in daily or sub-daily, all the way down to 15-minute increments if we're setting up actual workflows for people who are going to be working in these environments. But for large-scale CPG, manufacturing, productions, and sales, typically that's either weekly, monthly, or a 4-4-5 calendar. And then obviously something like pharma, they're looking at things at monthly or quarterly. They can potentially be doing it even annually for longer term forecasts. So it can really run the gambit, and it really depends on the industry that you're in, as well as how often you need to update this. So really the timing is a key importance of this. For this seminar, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a monthly process. By far, in my experience, this is the most common. Most people are updating their forecasts monthly. Now, that being said, even though we're using either monthly data or a 4-4-5 calendar where we have 12 or 13 whole 4 and 5 week periods in our calendar, the way that we actually do this on a monthly process can vary, and it really falls into two different process types. The first is that we would only use our forecasting tool at the beginning of each month. So for a few days at the beginning of each month, we're going to run our cycle. We're going to update our data, generate a new forecast, make our adjustments, and then finalize our forecast and export it. So we're really only using our tools at the beginning of each month. So this is a process that only takes a few business days. Now, the other alternative to doing a monthly process is actually we're going to work throughout the month. We're not going to confine our cycle to just happening once per month at the beginning. What we're going to do is we're going to update it throughout the month. A typical instance of this would be to update as we go, working within our forecasting tools and adjusting our forecasts at all times throughout the month, but then exporting our forecast, the final step of our process, only doing that at the end of each week. So while we have a monthly historical data set, when we're forecasting monthly or in 4-4-5, at the end of each week, whether we make adjustments or not, we're going to export our forecast and consume it that way. So let's give an example of what this would look like. So in our process number 1, we're going to confine ourselves to just working at the beginning of each monthly cycle. So how would it typically be laid out? Well, if we look at this as a business day example, we're just going to do this for the first 5 business days of our cycle. So day number 1, obviously we're going to start with our first piece, which is going to use our historic data. We need to gather up all of our history, all of our updated data. We're going to load it into the system, and we're going to generate a new forecast using all of our new data. And what are some of the steps that the people will be doing to generate this baseline forecast? Well, new forecasts are going to produce. We're going to look at the accuracy of some of them to maybe change some of the models. We might address new products that were issued, and we might enter overrides at this point. Then what we'll do is we want to distribute this baseline forecast to the other people where we're going to gather our business intelligence. And usually that's day 2 and day 3 of our business cycle here, where sales, marketing, management, operations folks are going to come in here and review the forecast, either individually or as part of some sort of process. And we're going to detail that a little bit more later on in the webinar. And they're going to actually make adjustments to the forecast. They might also look at accuracy. So they might review the accuracy of the forecast that they did previously in the previous cycle to see how they did, to maybe have that guide them for the adjustments that they make. But once everybody's had their say, of course, what we need to do is come up with some sort of consensus. So we can have some sort of consensus review meeting. We might make any additional changes either to the models themselves or the overrides to this, and we agree to a final consensus. And then obviously in the final and 5th day, we're going to output the final plan to our planning system and potentially run MRP or any kind of other business intelligence gathering off of this. But again, what we're doing is we're confining the whole process to just the beginning of the month. We're going to do this once, it's going to be a cycle, then we're going to repeat the cycle again next month with the same 5 business days. But in our process number 2 example, what we're going to do is we're basically going to take the day 2 and day 3 piece and we're going to expand it out. And what we're going to say is that throughout the month, as data comes in, as sales talks to customers, as marketing talks about the promotions that will come, as management makes any kinds of decisions, they're going to go and update the forecast as that information becomes available. So throughout the month, throughout time, they're going to come in here and they're actually going to make these adjustments for themselves. And these adjustments will come in as we go. And then at the end of each week or at some sort of scheduled period of time, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to then export that forecast that we've been changing out. So whether that's daily, whether that's weekly, this is how this process is going to be repeated. So it's not confined to just one. But in our examples that we're going to walk through today, we are going to try to focus on this kind of monthly cycle where we generate our forecast, make our adjustments, and export the forecast. Whether we do this in a process 1 or process 2, where we confine it to the beginning of the month, or we confine it where we're doing it throughout the month, we're going to focus on these monthly examples just because it is the most common. If you do have a weekly or daily, or for those of you who are doing it every 15 minutes, I'm sure you probably have a meeting to get off to right now because you have another forecast that is due. Obviously, you can bend these processes to your own experiences, but we're going to focus primarily today on this monthly process. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into these different steps that we've talked about. What are some of the questions that we need to do? So what do we need to ask ourselves? What are some of the key steps that we're going to do from some of these processes? And then let's look at some examples of how we would actually do this using our Forecast Pro tool. So we're going to start with our first step where we gather and update our data. Okay. So we have certain data considerations that we need to take into account when we get our data. So what data are we going to use? So obviously, if we're going to prepare a forecast, we need to have some sort of historical demand driving this. Is it going to be sales? Is it going to be orders? Is it going to be production? Is it going to be shipments? So we need to ask ourselves, because each of these have their own pluses and minuses. A lot of times this is dictated to you just by whatever ERP system you're using, because it stores one type of data and you might only have it. But if you have the option of choosing from these, obviously it's something to take into account. Is there additional information beyond just our historical data that we're using that could be helpful while we're doing our review? So what other information would it be useful to see when we're making these adjustments, when we're getting information and consensus that would help? For instance, do our customers give us forecasts? Especially those of you who work in big box informations and things like that, you might get forecasts from some of your customers. Or if you have small scale customers that they're actually doing it, you might go from that. Do you have budget information or AOPs? Do we have operating plans that the company has actually agreed to at this point? Thus, we want to go and follow those. Do we want to bring in open orders, which is especially important if we're doing this kind of ongoing process, which is when I look at the data at the beginning of the month versus looking at it at the end of the month, why don't I want to look at the orders that are already coming through for this month so that we can make adjustments based off of that? So it is important to think about all this other data that we can get in. And then finally, how is the data organized? What kind of hierarchy structure are we using? Because the hierarchy structure is very important both for a forecasting perspective as well as this consensus review forming. If I'm asking sales for information and they need to see it by customer, well, we obviously need to structure our hierarchy to include customer. Or if I'm looking at by product families, because we have product managers who are in charge of this, they might need to see those levels. So considering the kinds of levels that will be important, both from a forecast generation piece, as well as this collaboration piece where we're bringing in other people, is going to be very, very important, okay? So, couple of key things to think about here with the data before we look at an example, and just to expand out about this external information. What are some of the things? I just gave a couple. We talked about customer forecasts, we talked about current orders. We can also bring in budgets, we can bring in inventory. We also might need to see it in different units as well. So do I need to see it in dollars? Do I need to see it in euros? Do I need to see it by weight? Do I need to see it by pallets? This is all very important information for us to see when we're actually making these kinds of changes. So to show you an example of this, if we're going to come back through here, I'm going to go ahead and use our Forecast Pro tool to see this kind of information. So just a quick note here, we are actually demoing this today in our Forecast Pro Track version 6. So this is our newest version of the software. No, it has not been released yet. Let me say that again. No, it has not been released yet. And no, you haven't missed anything if you are a Forecast Pro user. We are still working on this. We hope to have it out shortly, but we are demoing it just so you can see some of the information here. So when it comes to this kind of data piece that we want to look at, when we're talking about this, what we want to do is we actually want to see the kind of information that could be helpful to us. So I had mentioned my open orders piece. So here's a good example of that, where I have a current forecast that has been generated. I can see my current orders throughout the month. So if I was standing here at the end of June, I'd say, look, I already have orders larger for June and this month and next month, which would be July, than I actually have a forecast for. And so this kind of information would be helpful for us to see it. Okay, we can also see here when we're looking at our previous forecast for here, well, I want to see my forecast that I did last month, especially when we're talking to sales or marketing, to see, has there been a very large change? Are you making large adjustments from that? So these are kind of really important pieces of information for us to see when we're doing that piece, okay? So now that we've talked about the data, now we actually have to go and generate a baseline forecast. So we've thought about what data do we want to bring in, how do we want to structure it, what outside information would be useful for us when we're actually making this forecast. So now we actually have to generate a new forecast. And what are some of the things that we would be doing here? So what we want to do is, again, this is a routine process, and there's certain key steps that tend to be repeated regardless of what company you're in, regardless of what industry you're in. And there's lots of different sort of key functionality that you're probably going to want to do. First is address any new products. This is a big deal. In our monthly process, I'm sure every month you're introducing new products are being added. Whether you're doing this weekly, monthly, quarterly, new products are being added no matter what business you're in, and we're going to need to address those somehow. Obviously, corresponding to this is we're going to want to discontinue old items, so items that are being replaced by something else. So how are we going to go and fix something like that? So we want to actually discontinue these old previously generated products. We want to look at forecast accuracy. So we want to say, well, how did we do last month? And we can see that kind of information as well. We also might want to add any kind of special events. If something strange happened last month, and now part of the history, we want to make sure that we're addressing this. So really on an ongoing basis, what we're looking for are things that are changing within this current forecasting cycle. New products are being added, old products are being removed. We want to look at how well we did last forecast cycle. We also want to address any of these spikes. You know, we're talking about how each month we're going to want to gather information about this. Well, when that actually becomes part of the history and these special events happen, we need to account for them for here. Now, one of the key things, of course, is who's in charge of this. We already talked about that a little bit earlier. Who's going to be in charge of this process? Typically, it falls upon either a forecast analyst, a demand planner, or some sort of business analyst. That doesn't mean that's the only place for it. A lot of times I've been to companies and it's, hey, you're good with numbers, you're now the forecaster. Or you're in operations and you understand the products, so you're now the forecaster. So it can really run the gambit in terms of who's in charge of this. It also is determined by how big of a team you have. If you have a large team participating in this process that gets cycled through, then you'll probably have somebody who is dedicated to generating this forecast. However, if you're just sort of a small company with just a small group of folks, it might be, you know, the responsibility of just whoever gets designated, you're now the responsibility of the forecaster. So to see some of these, what we would have to do, if we come back over here to Forecast Pro, obviously what we saw here is we can look at our forecast accuracy here with our differences. But again, we're using here over sort of our new layout functionality that allows us to basically reproduce the steps that we do each month. You can see I would create steps for these types of key activities that I'm going to do each month. So we said, what about a new product? So I want to get a new product list. So here I have a list of items that were added that had either 1 month of history, so they just got added this month, or have 0 months of history, which means that they were just added here. And if I wanted to address something like these, we would apply some sort of new product model to them. Here, what I've done is I've actually already pre-set up some ways of using our component models. Do things like I want to pick the pattern that I want to apply to this particular item. And you can see I can apply this pattern. And I'll be able to walk through our new products and deal with this. What I would also be able to do is come in here and track forecast accuracy. So we have these accuracy reports where I can see the data and basically showing me my largest deviation. I can see here, here's what actually happened last month. This blue line is what I forecast last month. You can see there's a large difference between the current forecast this month, but I can also see there's a large difference between what actually happened, which was 5,500 units, and what my previous forecast was, which was 2,500 units. And what we're able to do is we can create lists and reports here. You can see this one is now heat map based off of how big of an error there was going into here, so that I can actually see the items where I have the largest deviations with this different types of data. And I can go through and look at them and see where we really did. You can see here we have a very large spike, and we just did not do a good job of finding those errors. And of course, once we have these errors, what do we need to do with them? We need to bring the attention to folks where we actually can go and make adjustments to them. So again, coming back to our original screen saying, here's our forecast, here's what we said before, we'd want to come in and make adjustments to it. So again, setting up these kinds of predefined steps that you're going to run through when I'm generating the baseline forecast, these key steps that I'm going to run into. And the more routinized you can make this process, the better it will be, because we're just trying to go through these common steps that we're always looking at, okay? Now, once we have this baseline forecast, now we need to actually go and gather intelligence. We have to actually bring together the folks who understand the business. We need to bring together the folks who have the information, and now we need to actually go about making these changes. And so we're going to gather this business intelligence and form some sort of consensus. Now, as we've already talked about, we need to get this information from a variety of different people in a variety of different departments. Okay, this can include our sales, our marketing, manufacturing and operations, finance, or management, but we need to get this information into our forecasting process somehow. Now, there's a number of different ways of doing this, and I've seen it really done differently at different companies. And there's no really what I would say right or wrong way of getting this. The most important thing, again, is to create some sort of reproducible routine where we can bring this together. I'm going to illustrate 3 different techniques for getting this data together, okay? So the first would be a coordinated review. Now, especially when you have a small group or in a small company, this works very well, where we have the planner who's in charge of generating the statistical forecast. Basically, they are responsible for the entire forecasting process each month. And what they will do is they will meet individually with anybody who has a stake in the forecast, whether it's sales, operations, supply, whoever. They're going to actually go and meet with them. These folks will not make changes by themselves. They will plan some sort of meeting where we will have a 60 to 90-minute meeting with each of these individuals, whether that is in person or whether that is actually via some sort of web meeting, but they're going to present the forecast to these folks. They're going to meet with them, and then they're going to make these adjustments. Now, the advantage here of doing it this way is that the individual people who are making these adjustments do not need to learn new software. They don't even have to understand the statistics behind the baseline forecast. All they need to do is bring their knowledge to the process. The other thing it does is it allows a two-way communication. And a lot of these times when I see people doing review, one of the issues is this kind of siloing, where we ask each individual team member to make their changes independent of one another. What this allows the planner, the person who's centrally in charge of this, to do is it allows them to not only take the feedback from the folks who have the information, but they can also point out very specific information that they want to come back to them. They can say things like, wow, we did not do well in these 5 items. Do you have any insight into it? Or, wow, your adjustments last month really, really blew the forecast way too high. Why did we do this? Do we think it's going to continue? So we can have this kind of back and forth way of talking about it. Okay, and so there's a lot of pluses and minuses to doing it this way. The problem, of course, is if you have large teams and large groups of people, this becomes very hard to manage. And so it's hard for one person, one central key person, to meet with everybody, especially if multiple people are going to have their say in how this comes through. So we really want to make sure that while this will work in a small group, it tends to work pretty well. And again, how would we do this in Forecast Pro? What we would do is we would just come in here and we just make adjustments. So I, as the demand planner, would come and meet, and I would just come in here and I'd say, you know what, in July, what are we doing? Why is there such a big difference? And I would actually come in here and actually make adjustments this way. So I have the ability to meet with people individually, and this will help me to gather that information. The other important piece to this is that there is a central person responsible for the forecasting process itself. So when we are working in these small groups, somebody is responsible for it. And as long as somebody's responsible for it, the process tends to run more smoothly, and it tends to always have this kind of, we're always doing it on these first 3 days. Here's when I'm meeting with you. We can schedule these recurring meetings on our calendars, and we can really make sure the process goes through as quickly and efficiently as possible. Now, the second way to make this review is what we call sequential review. And this is where we actually move in sequence to how we're going, okay? So again, the demand planner is going to start, they're going to make the baseline, but then they're going to pass the forecast on to folks. They're going to say, here is the information, make your changes. What's important about this is it will happen in sequence. And so if sales makes a change, then production makes a change, and supply makes a change, as you move through the sequence, each subsequent person will be able to see the previous person's changes. And this could potentially affect what they're doing. Now, obviously, if there's not a lot of overlap, if instead of these being 3 different departments, they were just 3 different sales managers within a department, and I'm in charge of my items and you're in charge of your items, there isn't this kind of sequence going through, so there's probably not a lot of overlap in terms of the products or the customers that they are in charge of. So obviously, in this case, the sequential review isn't adding a lot of value. But if they really are in different departments, especially if you're assigning who's going to have the final say when we make these changes, then we can really do a good job with this. So we can really say, yeah, I'm making my changes, but then I get this information. I saw what sales said. Oh, well, that's interesting what they're saying. And so we're passing on the knowledge in sequence so that the subsequent user gets to see the information that the person has made. So there is some advantage to this, but of course, if there isn't really overlap in customers or in products, in that sense, this doesn't add a lot of value. Now, the most common way to do this, of course, is simultaneous review. This is kind of the siloing piece, where the demand planner generates the initial statistical forecast, then they pass that forecast on to each of the different folks who are going to make adjustments. These people will independently make adjustments on their own. Now, the beauty of this is that, especially if we have the only sort of beginning of the month process, that they can work simultaneously and we only need a short amount of time because each person has the same 2 days to make their changes. Also, if we're doing this throughout the month, if different salespeople are talking to different customers at different times, this has the advantage of whenever a salesperson talks to a customer, they can come in and make a change to the forecast directly, and they're just making a change to the items that they're responsible for. It also simplifies what each person sees because we're breaking up the data into smaller pieces just for that individual to make a change. Now, of course, the downside is we are breaking up the data. So if we're giving this to individual people, they're only getting information for just what they're seeing. We're going to have a subsequent review where we actually have a consensus review after this. Okay, so the advantage here, of course, is that each person is their own silo. They only have to focus on the items that they see. They don't have to see a very large, complicated hierarchy. They don't have any of those problems. However, they are very much siloed from one another. So there's not a lot of consensus, which would have to, of course, be done afterwards. It'd have to be some sort of consensus review, okay, where what we're going to do is we're going to actually go and make some changes. Well, we need to actually come up with a consensus for us to do this. Now, everybody loves sort of these acronyms for whatever their process is, and everybody tries to tweak them too. I find that a lot where people have these things and they have all this, whether you call it SNOP or SIOP or IBP or MIOE, whatever you're calling this process, it's, look, I need to come up with a review. Now, obviously, if you have this kind of, we're doing this simultaneous review where each person is working individually, we need to have this review after that process comes in because we need everybody to not only bring their changes together, but we need everybody to review it. Whereas if we did it sequentially, or whether we had it where we're actually meeting with each other one-on-one, where there's a point person who is consolidating all of these changes and coming up with a consensus, because if we do this simultaneously, we need to have this secondary process to come through and review it. Whatever you call it, however you want to call it, however formalized you want to make it, this obviously is a very important step because we don't want just these silos making changes. We want to make sure that we have some sort of review that people say, yes, this we agree with, this is our consensus process, okay? So I've talked about these 3 things. Let's sort of see a few examples of these here in Forecast Pro and the different sort of techniques that we offer in order to accomplish this. So something that is new in version 6 is one way to do this is now through Excel collaboration. All right, so what this means is this is very, very useful whether we're doing the initial sort of cooperative review where one point person is giving you just the forecast and they want to go back and forth, or whether we're doing the simultaneous review. What I want to do is I want to take a system and I want to break the data up into small pieces and I want to meet either individually with folks or give them the ability to do it. So this is the new version in Excel where we're actually, in Forecast Pro where we can actually take the data out of Forecast Pro and make these changes in Excel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually break down, you can see my hierarchy over here. We're going to use this for the 2 illustrations. I have my hierarchy over here. It's broken down by regions. So we have USA, South America, and EMEA. Then we have it broken down by 2 different divisions. We have retail and wholesale, and then we have our individual SKUs available to us. And so what I want to do is I can break this down. In this example, we're going to break it down by salesperson. So what I have done is I've loaded into the system which salespeople are in charge of which process. And what I've been able to do is export to Excel spreadsheets, one for each salesperson. I have a salesperson, Bill, and a salesperson, Sarah, who are making these changes. And I can export this information out to Excel. And what I'm able to do, so we can go ahead and open this up in Excel. You'll see this allows us to come in here and make some changes. So you can see I have the data. I can see it both graphically as well as numerically. I can also come in and make changes directly here. If I want to make this from 90 to 120, you'll see the change will appear, and we can actually see that over here. If I want to set this down to 1,000, I can come over here and make these changes. Making changes in Excel is a very common approach. No matter what tool you're using, you can't seem to escape Excel, no matter what, because folks are comfortable with Excel and taking the data out, making changes, and then importing it back into whatever forecasting tool you're using. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, let's break the data up into pieces, have people make those changes, and then import that information back into whatever forecasting tool you are using. In the case of Forecast Pro, we're sort of adding this ability here, okay? Now, the other way to do it would be, of course, to break it up here in Forecast Pro into sub-projects. So you can actually see here, I have broken up into 2 projects. I have that same data. Here's the USA project all by itself. And what I have over here is my EMEA project all by itself. And I can break the data up into smaller pieces, have each person individually work on their piece. And then, of course, what I have is the ability to create a super project. If I close these over here, I can come over here and actually combine these two. I can come over here and we will add all 3 of them. I have my EMEA, South America, and USA projects. And what this will be able to do is actually combine all of this data together. Okay, so I would actually be able to create a big super project, which we'll call here, that actually brings the data back together again. Okay, let me go grab all this stuff, and here we go. And so now I have a combined super project available to me. So this, of course, assumes that we're going to break the data up so that we can either do the first or a third, whether we're doing simultaneous review or whether we're doing a coordinated review where one person is in charge. We're really trying to break the data up into smaller pieces. And so whatever tool you use, this is really the most common approach most people take, is I want to break the data up so that either my salespeople get just what they're in charge of, or the regional managers get just what they're in charge of, or the product line managers get what they're in charge of. They get that information, they make their adjustments, whether it's coordinated, where there's somebody who's in charge and we sort of have a back and forth, or whether it's simultaneous where they're in their own silos, they're making that change. Now with the sequential review, because we're all working together in sequence, what we would of course need is we would need to have one unified process. So we'd have one project with all the data in it, and we would pass this complete process on to one another in sequence. And so if sales were to make a change and they were to come in here and say, set this to 130 units, and those of you who've done training with me, I'm breaking my own rules and not putting a comment in here. I'll say set to 130 because I'm trying to do this quickly to show you as much as I can. And then what I would do is I would pass it on to marketing, and marketing would come over here and they would make their changes over here. They would be and set this to 300 because that's what they think it is. And we'd have to do it in sequence. Now, of course, this can take longer, and it works better for our first process where we do everything at the beginning of the month, because we have this kind of routine. We do it in sequence and then we're done, because we're not going to want to repeat this sequence throughout the month where things are coming in. But it does make for a simplified, everybody actually gets to see what the other person did as we move through sequence. So it does buy you that kind of thing. It also allows everybody to see sort of grand totals. What are we looking at as a grand total level? We want to be able to see that information as well, as opposed to just seeing our siloed off piece. Now, if we do this, it's still a good idea to have that consensus review, because whoever was last in line saw everybody's changes, but of course whoever's first in line didn't see anybody else's changes, and they might have some information there. So again, setting up this process is really important. Defining who's going to be in charge of it is very important, and the order in which you do it, the kind of process. Am I breaking up the data into smaller chunks, or am I looking at it as a whole? Am I doing it in sequence, or am I doing it siloed, or do I have somebody coordinating all of this? These are really important questions to ask when we're coming up with a final process. Okay, and then finally, our last step is to, of course, export the final forecast out. And what do we do with this? Well, I've been doing this in Forecast Pro, obviously, because that's what I'm comfortable in. But once we're done in our forecasting system, what are we going to do with it? Well, the most common thing that folks do is to run MRP off of this. I'm going to take my final forecast and put into some sort of larger planning system to do all of my planning off of this, to take into account our minimum order quantities, our inventory on hand, our supply, our lead times, all of that stuff gets rolled into that. But not everybody does MRP from their forecast. Some people just dump it into some sort of reporting tool, right? So some sort of BI tool, whether it's Tableau, Crystal Reports, or SSRS. I want to push this data out and I want to review it, because we're not manufacturing, we're not in production. What we're doing is we're actually looking at what did our forecast do and how are we going to consume it. Maybe we're using it for finance, maybe we're using it for inventory planning, whatever we're doing with it, but I might want to put it into one of these better tools to make it look prettier, and that's what I want to do. And so you have lots of options there, or quite frankly, a lot of folks just put it into Excel. Okay, can't escape Excel. They might make their changes in Excel and they might put their final forecast in Excel, because some smaller companies really run their business almost entirely off of Excel. And so that's what they're really trying to do. But the key is I need to figure out where I'm going to consume it. And of course, this is important to ask, because wherever it's going, however it's going to be consumed will dictate things like how is the data formatted and how far out are we forecasting and what kind of process are we doing. It also determines the timing. Like we said, if we're running MRP, but we run MRP every night, well, maybe we do want to work throughout the month on our process. If we're just putting it to these reports and we're going to have kind of a consensus meeting once a month, then maybe we only do need to run this process at the beginning of each month, push it to our tools, have our review, and call it a day. So really, how we consume the forecast is also very, very important, because what are we doing with it? Once we get it out of our forecasting tools, where are we putting it? And that's important to ask, because it sort of dictates how all of this process works, okay? So that was our sequence. We got our data together, we generated a forecast, we gathered information, we came up with a consensus, and then we pushed our forecast out. I probably should have been doing that on the summary slide when I'm doing that. I'm counting on my fingers here, so if you saw me in the room, you'd be able to see that. All right, so what are some of the things that we talked about today? We want to determine who's going to oversee this process. Is there going to be a point person who's in charge of everything, or is it going to be more of a diffuse team effort? Is it a very large group of people who are going to be talking to it with multiple disciplinaries, or are we going to actually come in here and say, no, it's actually just one person, they're in charge of it? How often are we going to run this process? It is going to be repeated. Is it going to be every day, every week, every month, every quarter? We need to determine that. And even if we run it in our example like we did every month, well, are we really only doing it once a month, or are we doing it continuously, really? Throughout the month, we're just using monthly data. What data do we use? Well, beyond just the history and how it's structured, well, what other information might be helpful? Because we're building this consensus, we're building this review. How might people want to see it? Do I need to see, my open orders? Do I need to see what I said last month? Do I need to see this data in dollars? How can I see all that information? And obviously, going along with overseeing the process, who's giving this feedback? Is it going to be sales? Is it going to be marketing? Is it going to be management? Are there regional managers who are coming in? Are there product managers? Are we taking information from some of our customers that we're going to actually listen to? So if certain key customers give us their data, we're going to use it. If other customers give us their forecast, we're going to say, no, we can't really trust them. We're going to build our own process. So that's really, really important. Okay, how are we going to gather it? How are we going to actually set up the actual process, the reproducible process? Is it going to be something that we have these silos where I'm breaking the data into small pieces? Each person works independently of each other. Is there going to be somebody who's gathering and meeting with them so that there's kind of a dialogue going back and forth? Are we going to review this in sequence so I can see the changes of whoever's worked on it prior to me? So those are really important pieces to decide. Then obviously, once we have this forecast, how's it going to be consumed? I think one of the things I see all the time is people are like, oh yeah, I'm going out 12 months into the future. And it's like, well, what's your lead time? About a month and a half. And you do this every month. So why are you going out that far? Do you use it for planning? And they say, no, we're just using it for MRP. And we run MRP once a week. So there is this question of how are we consuming this forecast? Where is it going? Is it going into MRP? Is it going into some sort of BI tool? Or are we just dumping it to Excel because we want to populate this Excel sheet with all of our numbers? So those are really, really important questions to ask. And there's a whole multitude of things that I did not get to today, but just in general, from a big picture standpoint, we have this kind of process, this circular process. It's something that we repeat every month. There's a lot of routine that goes into it. When I come in and help folks implement a new forecasting process, a lot of times there's all right, the first couple of cycles, we need to get everything set up. Once we set it up, there is this kind of routine that we run through every month. And so how can we automate as much of it? How can we schedule as much of it similarly? So can we get on a schedule so we always have these meetings at this given day, come up with these timelines, and we stick to it? Routine leads to successful, happy forecasting processes. So the more you can routinize it, the better. Okay, with that said, I have a couple of logistics slides and then we will get to your questions. As Eric mentioned initially, our webinar today, as well as all of our previous webinars, have been recorded and are up on forecastpro.com. So those of you who attended today, we will be sending out a link once it gets posted with both the video itself as well as the slides, which we will send along with that as well. But please also visit some of the previous forecasts, previous webinars, because they're really good and they really help with all of that information. I also wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events. So we do run these webinars once a quarter. Our next webinar will be in January on forecast accuracy. So I showed a little bit about that today just to sort of show you previous forecasts and how people actually use that information as part of the forecasting process, but I'm going to dive really into it. Eric, our moderator, and Sarah, who's also here with me today, she and Eric will be doing this, and I highly hope you go and try to register for it. It's up on the website now, so if you just go to forecastpro.com/seminars, you'll be able to get to it. And we do have a save the date for a couple of upcoming events also in 2020. So we do have 2 live events coming up in 2020. The first will be a forecasting seminar on techniques, best practices, and applications in Europe. It will be in Amsterdam, May 13th through the 15th. So this is one of our live seminars that we'll be offering. So it's something that we'll be doing over in Europe. And then a big important one, to save the date, we will be doing a Forecast Pro user conference. After a hiatus of this year, it is coming back, and it's coming back strong. In September of 2020, we held at Cambridge, Massachusetts. It'll actually be held at MIT, which will be great. Details for this will be coming soon for these 2. We are finalizing all the information, but check back shortly at forecastpro.com to see information on these 2 live events that are coming up. But we wanted to make sure we got the dates out there for people to get that on their calendar and get them really excited about that. And then finally, I'm sure there are a question or 2 about this. For today's session, for some of the examples, we did use the new version 6 of Forecast Pro Track, which we are hopeful to release before the end of this year. Hopefully we're gonna get that out shortly. As you saw, it's coming along quite nicely, so it did have some of the new features. Again, we didn't really dive into many of them, but if you want to see more information about this version or any version of Forecast Pro, we are happy to do a live demo for you via WebEx. Again, you can just visit us at forecastpro.com and request that, especially if you want to see the new version. Hopefully we'll have a beta of that shortly. Okay, so that's the logistics. Not bad, 43 minutes. I'm pretty good at this, getting that 45 minutes in there. So with that said, what we would like to do is open up to questions. It looks like there are a lot. Eric is helping me out with this, so he's gonna read some of your questions. As he said, if we don't get to them just from this live back and forth answer here, we will obviously respond to you either via email or via the chat here as well. Okay, Eric, first question.
Okay. First question here is, what fraction of the clients you work with have a formalized consensus review process? And are there certain types of companies that are more likely to have one than others?
Okay, excellent question. So I would say probably about 65 to 70% do have a formal process. Whether they call it by these acronyms or whatever they call it by, they do have a review process. Most people want to look at the forecast before they actually consume it. So if I'm going to feed numbers into my planning system, I want to make sure somebody's got some eyeballs on it. So usually that is a review. Now, how much of a review and who's involved really does vary company by company. There are what I tend to call sales-driven companies, so they tend to be sort of resellers of products, and for that, they tend to have a lot of review because it's all consolidated into a single department in sales. Whereas a lot of CPG, if you have any kind of production or supply chain, because that the demand planner or the operations person is in charge of that process, they formalize a consensus review around that, whether they call it a formal SNOP or SIOP meeting, or whether they just say, look, we have a 10-minute meeting to make sure everybody's happy with these numbers. There is some sort of process there. Usually if they don't have it, it's some sort of smaller company where there's really just 1 or 2 people in charge of doing the forecasting, and there really isn't any kind of review that goes on in that part. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question here. It says, most of your examples are using a monthly process. How do things change if it is a weekly process?
Excellent question. Yeah, so we did focus on monthly. I'd say in my experience, about 75% of our users do monthly forecasting, even if they are doing it every week. In their mind, they tend to end up backing up into it. If you do have a weekly process, there's sort of good reasons to have weekly processes and bad reasons to have it. If you're doing any kind of longer term forecasting, say more than 3 months out, it really doesn't make any sense to do weekly because there's a lot of volatility. Weekly by its very nature is more difficult to forecast. It tends to be noisier. It tends to be lower volume. It tends to make the process a lot more difficult. However, what it is reactive. So the reason you would do a weekly process is if I have very short lead times. If I have a 1 or 2 week lead time and I have lots of inventory changes and I need to be very, very reactive to my business as it changes, then yes, you need to do a weekly process. Usually with a weekly process, it is ongoing. It is much less formalized because usually what ends up happening is the forecast is generated automatically every week. And what you're mostly managing by are exceptions, because what ends up happening with weekly data is there are a lot of spikes, because a single order or a single sale can cause a very large spike in a very short amount of time. That would kind of be smoothed out over a monthly process. And so a lot of what you're doing is reacting to spikes. So while you're still doing the same kind of process where I'm getting information from sales, from operations, that kind of thing, a lot of it is chasing down short-term spikes, like big orders coming in next week, or we just had a giant order last week, or we stocked out of this because we had a giant order 2 weeks ago. It's much more reactive, so it's much less formalized. It's much more reactive and ongoing, whereas the generation of the forecast tends to be much more automated. The adjustments tend to play a much larger role because you are reacting so quickly.
Okay, another question here. In your presentation, you have the demand planning in charge of the process, at least in the slide set. Is this most often the case? And if not, what other departments are involved?
Okay, good question. Yes, my Weeble is usually labeled demand planner just because he is. In general, that tends to be the person. It's either the demand planner or somebody who actually has forecast analyst as their title. Usually forecast analyst comes from larger companies where they actually have a dedicated team to generate the forecast. In most instances, usually if you're in any kind of production environment or whether you're in operations, it's somebody in operations who either knows the product lines very well, or it's somebody who is really just some sort of manager in terms of operations. They tend to get the forecaster role put into it. Only in extremely large companies is there somebody called a forecaster, and that's their only job. Usually it is one of many jobs that this person does. And usually because we tend to do demand forecasting, that tends to be where it resides. Sometimes it is done in finance, in pharma, it's done in production, but usually it is on the demand side. It's what is our expected demand going forward? That's usually the types of folks that we tend to work with. And in that case, it usually is a demand planner or some sort of demand analyst who gets the job, because it is, and usually this actually dictates how often the process is done. Is this their only role, or is this just one of many roles? And if it's one of many roles, the kind of let's just do all of this in the first 5 business days of the month because I have a whole bunch of other things we do throughout the month, that tends to be also a dictator of how the process is set up.
Okay, I'm actually going to we've had a number of questions that are regarding Track version 6 and in particular the interface to spreadsheets. Rather than going through individual questions, a lot of them are really wanting to learn more. So I think what I'll just reiterate something that James had said previously. This new release is scheduled to be launched before the end of the year. If your support and maintenance on Forecast Pro is up to date, you will receive it free of charge. We are putting together some materials to explain what's new. We will very likely also be running perhaps a web-based demonstration of the new functionality as we get a little closer. For those who might be interested in getting sort of an advanced look or maybe use a pilot or a beta copy, feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to bring you in on what we're doing in that regards and give you a quick peek at it. But again, we won't answer. I've got at least 9 or 10 individual questions that doesn't make sense to address in front of the group as a whole. So again, I want to thank James Berry for presenting our webinar today. I hope everybody found it informative and useful. I want to thank everyone who's attended for taking an hour out of their day. I hope it was worthwhile and that you've learned a few things perhaps that you can apply at your own firms. And I would encourage everyone to sign up for our next webinar, which is coming up in a month, in 3 months actually, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you all.